Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again for afternoon tea. You may have felt that in our Bible overview in this series that we started rather slow. I think some of you were worried that we were never going to make it out of the book of Genesis. Well, your patience has been rewarded. Here we are today and we have arrived in the New Testament. Now you might remember from yesterday that we left Israel in exile. That was obviously a bad thing. That was not the place they wanted to be. Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple had been destroyed, and so therefore the nation of Israel is no longer the vehicle by which God will gather people to himself. Now it is the remnant within Israel that is the focus of our attention. And so now we are looking for how God is going to rescue the remnant in order that he can gather people to himself and fix this broken world. Well, before we get to our text today in John chapter 11 and 12, I wanted to stop ever so briefly in the first book of the New Testament, Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew chapter 1, Matthew gives us a genealogy of Jesus. In fact, he traces Jesus all the way back to Abraham, who we're familiar with from our brief stop in Genesis chapter 12. But what's of interest to us today is how Matthew ends his genealogy. It's in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Listen to what he says. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 generations from the exile to the Messiah. You see, as far as Matthew is concerned, what ends Israel's exile is not after 70 years when they return to the smouldering ruins of Jerusalem. In Matthew's, as far as Matthew is concerned, what ends the exile is when Jesus, God's Messiah, arrives. And so what we're looking for from this point on is how does Jesus, who is God's Messiah, how is he going to end the exile? How is he going to gather people back, the people who have been scattered? How is Jesus going to gather them back again? And that's why we're going to turn today to John chapter 11, and then briefly after that, John chapter 12. So if you've got it there, make sure you've turned it open. Well, in John chapter 11, after the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, the Pharisees get together and they have a meeting. They're starting to panic because Jesus' popularity is growing and they don't know what to do about it. And so in John chapter 11, verse 47 is where we pick it up. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting at the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Now, if I'm just going to pause there for just a second, I think that comment's a little ironic because we saw yesterday that when King Nebuchadnezzar invaded, that was when God took away from Israel their nation and the temple. And yet here the Jews are still worried that they've got something to lose. It makes you realise that maybe they needed to go and reread their Old Testaments a little bit more closely too. Nevertheless, we're going to push on because the key verse here is verse 50. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realise that it is better for you that one man die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. Now he did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and to make them one. Now we've been doing this overview long enough now that I'm sure those words triggered all sorts of ideas in your head. The scattered children of God. That's what we've been talking about. And that is a reference to the exile. Now Caiaphas the high priest, who was no friend of Jesus, was given a prophecy by God to realize that Jesus' death would not just bring back together God's people, but would indeed bring back together all those who have been scattered. I think he spoke beyond what he could possibly know. But this is helpful for us because it answers the question, how is Jesus, God's Messiah, going to restore God's people and gather them together? Well, the answer is he's going to do it by dying on the cross. That's how people who have been scattered under judgment are going to find their way back, not just to God, but also to become part of his people. Now, don't take Caiaphas' word for it, because in the very next chapter, John chapter 12, Jesus confirms this himself. If you turn to John chapter 12, verse 30, Jesus had just been speaking about his death and resurrection, and on this occasion, God himself had spoken from heaven in a voice that people could hear in order to confirm that what Jesus was saying was true. And that's where we pick it up in chapter 12, verse 30. Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for the judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Now, when Jesus is talking about being lifted up, it could mean any number of things at first. Perhaps it's a reference to him being lifted out of the tomb, talking about his resurrection. Or maybe to be lifted up is talking about him returning to heaven, which would of course be a reference to the ascension. But we know it's neither of those two things by reading the very next verse. That's why it's always important that you read your Bible in context. Because in verse 33, John says, Jesus said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. So the lifting up that Jesus had in mind was him being lifted up on the cross. Now, we normally think of the cross being a horrible punishment and torture, and it's not really exalting someone to lift them up on the cross. But as far as Jesus was concerned, it was. Because when he was lifted up on the cross, that is the moment in his death when he would draw all people to himself. When Jesus says all people, the meaning of that verse is not every single person who's ever lived, but rather all kinds of people. People from all over will be able to come and find their place in the gathering of God's assembly when they come to Jesus and his death on the cross. So you see, without a shadow of doubt, both from the voice of Caiaphas the high priest, confirmed by Jesus himself, the truth is that the gathering of God's people, the end of the exile, the formation of the new people of God around the remnant that God had kept safe for this very purpose, only happens when you come to the cross and have your sins forgiven. Now, we've been running Discovering Christianity as a Zoom online course this term. And as we work our way through that material, we go through Luke's Gospel. And just the other day, we were reading through Luke's Gospel and we came across a tricky verse, and someone on the course asked a very good question about it. And I thought I'd bring it up here because it's really relevant to what we're talking about today from John. The verse is this. It's Luke chapter 12, verse 51. Jesus is speaking and he says, "Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, I've come to bring division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. It's a puzzling verse, isn't it? It sounds counterintuitive to what we would expect to hear from Jesus. And the question, quite rightly so, was, does Jesus come to bring peace and draw people together? Or does Jesus come to create discord and divide people? And the answer is both. I think during the course last week, I probably avoided answering this question. So Joe, here's an answer for you right now. It's probably best if we talk about it by way of illustration. My daughter had a birthday this week, and I've now got 2 teenagers in the house. I was thinking back to all those little kid birthday parties that we used to put on when they were 4, 5, 6 years old. And imagine you're back at one of those kids' birthday parties. And I get up and I call all the kids and I say, kids, it's time for ice cream. Put up your hand if you'd like chocolate ice cream. And just imagine that half the kids put up their hands and say, yes, please. And I say, fantastic, come over here, line up here for your chocolate ice cream. If you're at that party and witnessed what I'd just done, then it would be quite right of you to say, Scott's announcement resulted in a gathering of children who liked chocolate ice cream. However, it would be equally true to say that Scott's announcement created division at the party. It divided the kids into 2 groups, those who liked chocolate ice cream and those who preferred something else. Well, in the same way, that's the meaning of Jesus there in Luke chapter 12. When Jesus comes and he is lifted up on the cross, he makes it crystal clear. This is a gathering moment. The cross is now the point of reference for anyone who would come and be part of God's people. And so Jesus, or I should say God, gathers people to his Son at the cross. And yet it's also equally true to say that the cross will divide people, because there are those who don't want to come to the cross to have their sins forgiven. There are those who would prefer another way. And so for those people, the cross will divide. The cross will separate out those who want to come to God through his Son and those who don't. So I guess the best way to finish today's afternoon tea is to ask you a very important question. What have you done with the death of God's Son Jesus on the cross? Have you made it your gather point? Is that where you go to find your identity, to know that you belong, and to find your place amongst God's people, his church? Or are you still waiting? Are you still looking for perhaps another option? Well, Jesus himself is crystal clear. He is the narrow gate. You either come through Jesus at the cross, or you do not come at all. Well, we're going to pick up this idea of Jesus on the cross as the gathering point for God's people and what that means for him after his death, resurrection and ascension. Because for tomorrow, I'm going to get you to read Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. If you've got a bit of time, then read all of chapter 2. But if you're a little bit pushed for time this week, Acts chapter 2, 1 to 13, and we're going to tune in tomorrow to find out the next exciting stage in God's unfolding plan of salvation. Look forward to seeing you there.